All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Choosing a DNA Test for Your Research Goals. My name is Kathleen McKenzie, Education and Programming Manager here at American Ancestors, and I will be the moderator for today's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history, and we're pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is Senior Genealogist Melanie McComb. Melanie holds a BS from the State University of New York at Oswego. She is an international lecturer who teaches on a variety of topics, including colonial through 20th century American military research, genetic genealogy, Atlantic Canadian, African American, Jewish, and Irish genealogy. She is also an honorary fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. She has had articles published in American Ancestors Magazine and 50 Plus Advocate. She is also a blogger known as the Shamrock Genealogist. So, DNA testing has been a transformative tool for genealogists. However, it can be difficult to determine which test or tests to utilize in order to help you achieve your research goals. So, in this online lecture today, Melanie will provide an overview of the types of tests available, and she will also discuss how each test may be able to help you with your research and how to interpret your results. At any point during the presentation, please feel free to go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A panel found at the bottom of your screen. We'll address as many as we can at the end. There's also an optional syllabus available for purchase if you're interested, and your purchase helps support us in making these free webinars. This presentation is also being recorded for later viewing on our website and our YouTube channel. So if you missed something on today's first listen, don't worry, you can always go back and review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Melanie.
Okay, thanks, Kathleen, and hello, everybody, and Happy New Year. And as we're talking about new things in genealogy, this is also a time to be reevaluating how you can use DNA. So the first thing you might be curious about is, well, why should you use DNA for genealogy? Isn't the paper trail enough to be able to confirm our family tree? Well, I'd like to look at the DNA as a way to apply the scientific method to our family tree, because you can actually use it to test a hypothesis about a particular ancestor or maybe someone's origins to find out different countries that your family may have come from. And that can be helpful whether you're trying to confirm a line on your matrilineal line on your mother's line or your patrilineal on your father's line. It also can give you a lot of ideas of if there was a non-paternity event that may have occurred in your family tree. And we'll talk more about that later, but this identifies potential adoptions or other newer relatives that might come up. It even can help you identify if you have any regional Native American ancestry. So you may be curious to see if there was any ties back to one of the Native American tribes. You might be able to see evidence of that. But there are some things that DNA can't do. As DNA is a tool, you can't use it by itself to solve a brick wall when you're trying to identify an ancestor without doing some type of genealogical research. There's always going to be some kind of paper trail that is going to back up the results that you're seeing and that you should always use to verify. While you can identify regional Native American ancestry, it can't necessarily tell you what tribe you belong to. That is more of a membership role question. So you may have an idea that maybe you have Cherokee or Mi'kmaq based on that region, but it's not necessarily going to determine specifically that it's only that tribe and not another tribe in that area. And it can't just be full positive proof of any kind of distant kinship. Again, we need to use genealogy records to prove if you have a distant ancestor, let's say, that goes back to a Mayflower passenger or someone even earlier, such as in Europe, for example. So there's a couple of concepts to think about when we're doing our family history is we are doing a genealogical tree, which is going to include all of your ancestors. So you're going to take them back as far as you can and try to research as much as possible. But your genetic tree is different. It actually only includes the ancestors that you inherited DNA from. So usually you can go out to, from a lot of ancestors, out to roughly your fifth great grandparents to get that, to see what DNA you might have inherited. But just to give you an idea of what percentages go down, there actually is a bit of a drop off, especially when you get past that fifth great grandparent. So, for example, there is a 100% probability you will inherit DNA from your great grandparent or your second great grandparent. When you start going back to fifth great grandparent, you start to get a 5% drop off of not inheriting that DNA. This goes even down to less than half for an eighth great grandparent and only down to 15% for a 10th great grandparent of inheriting that DNA. So you definitely can see why we generally say that you can go out to your fifth great grandparents with a bit of confidence with DNA, but when you're starting to go beyond that, the chances of seeing that DNA in there is becoming slimmer and slimmer the further you go back. I'd like to also use DNA as a tool to connect with other cousins because many people are researching the same families and specific ancestors in the different locations that they're interested in. I actually first started testing my DNA almost exactly 10 years ago. And I've actually connected with a number of different cousins over the years, and some of them I've even met up in person with. We've exchanged all kinds of stories, photographs, even unpublished genealogy manuscripts that were started, and even ones that are still works in progress. I've even obtained the family Bible in my own family, but I've also obtained other types of family heirlooms and other things that family have passed down and knowing more about their story. And I think that that's another really interesting part of this DNA process is it's not only just about tracing your genetic ancestors, but also connecting with the living relatives as well. So let's dive into some of the biology and basics to help you understand what DNA is and how is it being tested in these DNA tests. So we have to start from the beginning, going back to a little bit of science class here. So when we talk about DNA, you've probably heard this expression that it is the building blocks of all living things. It's what makes us us. Every person's DNA is going to have some similarities, but there's going to be differences too, such as eye color and hair color, disposition to certain diseases, for example. Even like food sensitivities, like if you have the gene that lets you taste soap when you have cilantro in your meals. But it's this genetic material that you've inherited from parent to child which makes us us, which is why when you start to see photographs of others that you're related to, you start to notice similarities in how someone might look, and that's part of this genetic makeup. So the most common type of DNA, especially we're going to explore today, is what we call autosomal DNA. Autosomal DNA just refers to the 22 chromosome pairs that you have, which you see on this right-hand diagram. So you have one set that comes from your mother and one set that comes from your father. It doesn't include the sex chromosomes, which we call the X and the Y. And these autosomes are all involved with making who you are and also, different predispositions or avoidance of different diseases and illnesses that might come up. When you have mutations in some of these autosomes, that can actually have a lot of serious health effects for you. Mitochondrial DNA is another type of DNA that exists. So, largely when we're talking about the DNA, we're talking about this is the mitochondria is basically the energy powerhouse of the cell. So what you see on the left-hand side is a picture of a cell you would see under a microscope, and your autosomal DNA is coming from the nucleus, so the center of that cell. And the mitochondria is all those little floating bits that you're seeing there. These pieces of DNA are inherited from your mother and are passed down from mother to child. Another type of DNA that exists is the X chromosome DNA. So, as I mentioned, that it is the X, for example, chromosome, which is one of the sex chromosomes. This is something that is going to be different than you're seeing from the regular autosomal DNA, which is looking at the 22 chromosomes. So this is the now one of the sex chromosomes. So the X chromosome is passed down to everybody. So females are going to have two copies of the X chromosome, and males are going to have one because they're going to have a Y as well. And something to consider though is that it often gets mixed up with mitochondrial DNA. And I think it gets mixed up a lot because of how it's passed down. It's passed down from, mothers passing it down both to both their sons and daughters, but the fathers are also passing down the X chromosomes to their daughters as well. So it is very different in that way because mitochondrial only comes down from the mother versus X chromosome can actually come from both sets of parents when you're looking at that inheritance. So keep that in mind, it is different. The next type of DNA is Y chromosome DNA. And this is, again, looking at the other sex chromosomes with the Y chromosome. So males are going to have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome, as you can see in the little box there. And the Y chromosome DNA is also found within the nucleus of the cell, just like the autosomal DNA. But it's only passed down from father to son. So let's kind of give an example of some of this X and Y chromosome inheritance just to make sure it's really crystal clear. So up at the top, you have a male who is XY, and on the left-hand side, you have a female who is XX. So the male is passing down an X to the daughters and the Y to the sons. And the woman on the left-hand side is contributing the X to both the sons and daughters. And that combination helps show you why daughters are showing as XX and males are showing as XY. When we think about also the X chromosome inheritance and how this affects genealogy, this is what the male inheritance of the X chromosome looks like. So here we have in the center is a male, and the X chromosome is being inherited in this case from his mother, which is in pink right above it. And then up at the top, you have a blue piece and a pink piece. So you have an X coming from father and then the X from the mother, and it keeps going out. And this shows you all the different possibilities within a fan chart of different ancestors that may have contributed that X chromosome. So for males, it's a little bit easier because you know that you can look at this part of the pattern and see a limited number of ancestors. But when we compare it to a female, in this case, we can see that we're getting the X from the mother and the father, and we're seeing more options available, which means that when you're generally looking at a DNA match, it's a lot easier to determine the X chromosome inheritance of a male because there's less options. But for a female, it could come from many different directions of that family tree, where it's going to be a lot harder to identify which ancestor that might have come from. Let's talk about the different types of DNA tests that are available that you can use to test your DNA at. So some basic principles for using DNA testing. So the different companies are using what are known as genetic markers, and they're looking at your DNA and they're comparing it to other people that have tested with that same company. And they're also comparing that DNA to different population groups to give you those ethnicity results. So you can understand like how Irish or Italian or Greek or British or any other ethnicity out there of how you compare to other people in the world. But these results are very much speculative and they very much change over time. So keep in mind that your results today are not going to be the same, let's say, when there's an update 6 months from now. So, similar to how we see the different types of DNA that exists, there are three main tests out there. There's the autosomal test, which is looking at those 22 chromosomes and also includes the X chromosome. The mitochondrial test, which is looking at the mitochondrial DNA, and the Y DNA test, which is looking at the Y chromosome DNA. So let's talk a little more about detail about these. So, with the autosomal DNA, it is basically looking at what are known as the SNPs, and that's basically an acronym. It stands for single nucleotide polymorphism, but I like to think of it as more these are pieces of the chromosomes. So when you look at the chromosomes in this picture here, you can see how there's different portions kind of showing different segments on them. So think about them testing these pieces of them together. So the test is going to look at the 22 autosomal chromosomes and the X chromosome, which everyone has. And if we think about autosomal DNA in percentages, this gives us an idea of what level of DNA and how much we get from our ancestors. So we start off with getting 50% from each parent. So one from the mother's side, one from the father's side. Then you have it, that number divides in half when you go back to grandparents. So now you're going to 25%. Great grandparents, we're going to divide in half again to about 12 and a half, and then so forth and keep going back. So that gives you an idea of why the DNA is so small when you get out to your fifth grade grandparents or so. And that's because it's a very small fraction compared to your more closer ancestors. So, what is autosomal DNA good for? It is really good for determining some very close relationships. So, if you were trying to confirm if someone was a parent, a grandparent, a child, first, second cousins, etc., that's great. And so, general rule is you can use autosomal DNA to confirm back to your fifth grade grandparents. So, looking at about 6 or 7 generations. You can also use autosomal DNA if you have parents that have tested to even see which chromosomes you might have inherited from both your mother and your father. And this is helpful, obviously, when your parents do test or if you have a way to derive that test. And also identifying what we call continental origins. So, which means that we can't necessarily always go back to the specific countries our families are from, but we can at least maybe identify maybe parts of Europe or Asia or Africa or South America that our families do come from. The mitochondrial test is testing what we call the full mitochondrial DNA. So remember those little squiggles that we saw in the cell? These actually are represented now as rings that are being tested. So when the mitochondrial test first came out, they weren't always testing all of the parts of the ring. So we're finding that the test now is much more complete and a better picture to look at that mitochondria that was passed down from your mother's line. So, since we know that mitochondrial DNA is inherited from mother to child, we need to think about what that can get us to, and that's getting back to your direct matrilineal line. So remember that so males can inherit their mitochondrial DNA, but if we test their mitochondrial DNA, we're only going back on their direct maternal line. But generally, with very few exceptions, males don't pass that mitochondrial DNA on to their child. So it stops there. So what is mitochondrial DNA good for? It's good to help you research your direct maternal ancestry. So if you want to go all the way back to your mother's line, etc., you can go back quite a ways. It's also really good if you were trying to determine a very specific question, such as if you know if two people have the same mother or maternal grandmother and trying to fit in within a particular family group. Mitochondrial DNA is very good at looking at that. It's even really helpful when you're trying to go back to maybe some of the early colonists that may have came to places like the colonies back in in the 1600s to try to look at that direct maternal line. You may be able to identify who that ancient ancestor is that may have come over. Y-DNA, like similarly like mitochondrial now, is now looking at your direct paternal ancestry. So going all the way back to your father's 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 father, all the way back to as far as you want to go. You also can use this to, it's very helpful to do a one name study project because mitochondrial DNA surnames are going to change very frequently, most likely. But Y-DNA, if you're trying to research, let's say, the Brown family, you may want to look at that Y-DNA going back to see if you could trace back to the earliest Brown ancestor. So that's can be helpful, and a lot of people are doing what's called one name study projects to look into those that are actually are part of those earlier ancestors. And again, looking at those really early immigrants that may have come over to places like the American colonies in the 1600s, Y-DNA is really good for that as well. So, as a reminder, the Y-DNA test is testing one of your sex chromosomes and specifically the Y chromosome that males carry. And so, because of that, only males can take the Y-DNA test because it is passed down from father to son. Okay. So, now that we've talked about some of the basics and some of the testing, now let's talk about what are your research goals for why you are testing and what test is best. We've made this helpful chart, and there's a couple of different charts I'm going to show you here to talk about what test is best for your goal. So, if you're just trying to understand maybe where your family may have come from over time and learn those earlier ethnic origins, an autosomal DNA test is usually a best start because it's going to reveal some of those early continental regions and give you an idea of, maybe if you show up as a certain percentage Irish or Italian or another ancestry as well, connecting with those closer genetic cousins that you might want to meet, like I talked about. So if you want to, connect with others beyond your first cousins and connect with those that might be studying the same families, an autosomal test is best. If you're trying to maybe identify more closer biological family, such as if there was a parent that may have found as a result of adoption or other non-paternal events, or trying to connect with maybe potential siblings to see if maybe they had tested their DNA. Again, autosomal because it is much closer. Now, when you're trying to identify a male ancestor, and roughly when you're trying to get within, your first 5 generations or so, you generally may want to start with an autosomal test first, and then maybe resort to Y-DNA to help with that. Because the autosomal DNA is going to get you back to about your fifth great grandparents, but you may need the Y-DNA potentially just to help confirm a little bit more information. But if you're trying to go back much further, and I like to say to people, like, if you're thinking about, well over, 300 years ago or so, you're likely going to need to go and resort to Y-DNA to look at those historic male ancestors. Similarly, if you're trying to identify an early female ancestor within those first few generations, you might want to start with an autosomal test and then go to mitochondrial DNA. But again, if you're trying to resort to someone probably over 300 years or so, probably best to look at mitochondrial DNA test on its own because autosomal is just not going to go back that far. And finally, also, if you're curious about your predispositions to different health issues or different traits, recommended to use autosomal tests like through 23andMe, and even my heritage is doing some as well. I know when I first got started with my DNA testing about 10 years ago, I actually did it for health reasons. So that might be another thing that might be on your mind as well that might not be directly related to genealogy. So let's talk a little bit about some of the different testing companies that exist. So these are the major players in the DNA testing industry. So that includes Ancestry DNA, Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage DNA, and Living DNA. So if we kind of break down the different types of companies by type of test, all of these five do some type of autosomal DNA. So some of these may involve a cheek swab or where you give a saliva test and you spit in a tube and you can get your test your autosomal DNA. If you want to have specialized results by testing your mitochondrial or your Y-DNA, there's currently only really two companies that are doing these results right now, and that's Family Tree DNA and Living DNA. I will say Family Tree DNA, as I'll show you in a few, that they have a much larger database and a lot more tools available, but there are two companies that do exist. So this is actually a chart from the International Society of Genetic Genealogy wiki, where they describe the different autosomal tests, and it's updated regularly based on different updates that come out throughout the year. So just to give you an idea of the differences between the companies. So Ancestry DNA is obviously the largest when it comes to DNA testing. This was as of December of 2024, over 25 million. And I will say this was before the holiday season, so that number might have already grown already because DNA test kits are actually popular gifts that we do see are purchased around this time. 23andMe is then followed by about 14 million, so about almost nearly half of that. MyHeritage almost at 9 million, Family Tree at 1.6, and 300,000 for Living DNA as the smallest. Generally, these tests are going to have a range of prices, whether they're going to be approximately $70 to $100. You'll notice that the higher ranges are actually referring to the add-ons you can do for these tests. Most of these companies are adding on a health package where you can test those different traits and different markers for health reasons, like with 23andMe. Ancestry has done something like that with their traits. MyHeritage has as well. And even to the point that some of these companies have even added on genetic counseling as an option with those tests as well. So if you have concerns about results, they actually have ways of having you talk with professionals about those results and connect with your doctor as well. There are different collection methods. So Ancestry and 23andMe do a saliva or spit test versus MyHeritage, Family Tree, and Living DNA do a cheek swab, where you basically take like a Q-tip and swab in your cheek to get those cells. Each of those methods are ways of how we can obtain DNA. Now, it wasn't that long ago, several decades ago, it actually was blood was the only way that you could obtain DNA. So it's definitely gotten to be more, to be less invasive than it used to be. Now, these companies also have different capabilities on if you're allowed to upload your DNA from elsewhere. So, MyHeritage, Family Tree, and Living DNA do allow you to upload from other sites. However, Ancestry and 23andMe do not. And there also are options for chromosome views or browsers. And currently, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree offer options. Ancestry and Living DNA do not at this time. So there are many different options on some of these sites. So Ancestry over the last year or so rolled out a couple options that have changed, especially if you've tested previously. If you don't have an active membership with them, there is a membership through a regular family, like a genealogy subscription or a DNA subscription. These are the features you have if you just take the test and you don't opt into any additional features. So you do learn about those ethnicity estimates, which they call ancestral regions. They learn about different communities of people that you might fall into, such as like different settlers of an area, or maybe people that had come over to a different province at one point, like in Canada or in Europe. You might see some of those communities. Those are now called ancestral journeys. You see your match list, you can contact those matches, you can compare your DNA with them, and you have limited options on traits, so different genetic traits that you might have, and also shared matches, which are also limited to 3. Now there is an add-on for the Ancestry DNA Plus, and this price, I'm not sure if it's changed a little bit. I thought it was roughly around, I can't remember if it was about, if it was a flat fee or not, so I won't quote the price here. But basically, now you have more options. So, in addition to having your results broken down for ethnicity and communities, it also allows you to break down approximately where the breakdown is by parent. So, they may give you like a parent one and parent two, and you may be able to figure out based on your parents' ancestry which one corresponds to which. You also can see how your matches differ by parents. You also have different tools which include unlimited traits and shared matches. And there are other tools available, such as through lines, which really gives you a theory on how you're related to different people and their ancestors in their trees. And there's something that's very similar to like a DNA painter option called chromosome painter, which gives you an idea of approximately what chromosome segments might come from each parent, for example, and where they come into ethnicity. Family tree DNA, as I mentioned, also has an autosomal test. They call it Family Finder. So, like any autosomal test, it's testing both sides of your family, so anyone can take this test. Y-DNA and mitochondrial are offered by Family Tree. So, just as a reminder, only males can take the Y-DNA test, but anyone can take the mitochondrial test, but it's only testing the direct maternal line. And your Y-DNA test is testing the direct paternal line. So with the Family Finder option, you get your DNA match list. If you upload your results from another site, there is an unlock fee of $19, which gives you availability for different tools such as a chromosome browser, a chromosome painter, different ethnicity estimates that you can see, and even ancient origins, which goes back a little bit further to give you an idea of some of that DNA you might have inherited from many thousands of years ago. And with the family tree DNA, Y-DNA, and mitochondrial tests, you also receive match lists for those tools as well. And you also get what's called an assigned haplogroup. A haplogroup is basically a code to identify human migration across the globe. So people that share the same haplogroup usually share the same kind of migration patterns. So, like my example, my father is R1B1, for example, and he has largely Irish ancestry. So his match list is going to consist of other people that are actually with share his Y DNA evidence, as well as with that migration pattern. And then I have a different haplogroup from my mother's side. 23andMe also gives you again an autosomal test. You get your match list. You see people that you can match with. I will say it is a little bit trickier when you're trying to share information between DNA matches because you have to opt to connect with people on there. They do give you an initial haplogroup based on your autosomal test. However, it is not as specific as if you had tested with family tree DNA or living DNA for that Y-DNA or mitochondrial haplogroup. So just keep that in mind. They do also have some other tools such as a chromosome browser and creating a family tree. Keeping in mind though that there was a data hacking issue in last year or so. So some of these tools were taking offline and are kind of slowly coming back. So just keep that in mind that if you don't see everything available, it's because they are still trying to restore it and keep things more secure. They also provide medical reports that you can add on for an added fee. And if you had previously tested with 23andMe, like myself, where you did it a while ago, you actually may be asked to order a new kit if you want to keep up to date with the most current reports. Most of them are health related. MyHeritage DNA also gives you a match list. You can contact your matches. You can even export your matches into spreadsheets, which is really helpful. They have their own unlock fee, so you can upload the DNA from other sites like Ancestry or Family Tree or 23andMe. And that unlock fee gives you the different availability for the ethnicity estimates, your chromosome browser, shared matches, shared places in common, those ancestral places, a theory of relativity, which is very much like what we see in Ancestry's through lines, and an auto clustering tool, which can show you how you're related to different DNA matches from a more visual perspective. And then the other company is Living DNA. So Living DNA really came on the block, I would say, in the last, probably at least 6 or so years ago, maybe. And they largely have marketed themselves as being able to have a more accurate way of testing your British Isles ancestry, and especially they said for like England, and I think in like Scotland and Wales, they found they were pretty good, but mostly England was really strong up them, that they would able to narrow down more of where your family might have come from in England. They also provide you again with that match list, a shared matches list. There is a separate fee for a chromosome browser, and they offer the Y-DNA and mitochondrial tests, which they call the Y-DNA is called the father line, and the mitochondrial is the mother line. Okay. So now that we've talked about the different companies, and let's say you've taken your test, let's talk about when you actually review your autosomal DNA test results. What are you actually going to see? So one of the first things that you might want to go to, and a lot of people usually do, is they check out their ethnicity estimates. They're looking for those percentages which are showing where you have your family from. So as I mentioned, they're mostly going to focus at the more continental level, and then over time you might find that they start getting into more country specific as more and more people are testing. So, but it's not an exact science. So, keeping in mind that when you're getting the DNA from each parent, you don't get a full even 50% from mom, 50% from dad. So, it can be slightly skewed where you might have, where even compared to your siblings, you might have one ancestry ethnicity higher than another. And each site uses their own algorithm for calculating out your ethnicity estimates. So, that's why each company is going to be looking differently. So if we give an example, this is my ethnicity estimates on the left-hand side for ancestry, and on the right-hand side is showing the map that corresponds with it. So for example, showing the percentages, it shows that I am 48% Irish, and it's showing me that community or journey with Ulster and Northern Ireland of showing where approximately where a lot of my family was from. I have 38% Ashkenazi Jewish, 12% Baltics, and 2% Wales. And the colors that are used for each of the different percentages and the regions are corresponding with the map on the right hand side. And you'll find that most of these sites are going to give you some kind of map to give you an idea of where your family was from. So when I mentioned that they use different algorithms, they use what are called reference panels, which means that they're taking DNA from people that have lived in different populations that have ancestry for a very long time. So if we wanted to compare DNA, let's say, to someone that had family in, let's say, Poland, we would want family that have stayed in the same area for multiple generations to make it a more consistent control of how to compare those results. We wouldn't want someone that's moved from several different regions or other countries as a way to compare. We want someone that's staying very static. And that's how they can tell you, like, well, how much percentage, maybe Polish you are or Eastern European, for example. And so each of these companies has their own set of samples that you can use, and you'll find that some of them will have higher numbers of people that have tested in certain populations. So that's why it explains the variance between the different tests. So I'm on the left-hand side with Ancestry, where it shows I have approximately 48% Irish, 38% Ashkenazi Jewish, 12% Baltics, 2% Wales. Family tree DNA. I've tested my DNA. You'll notice my Irish is down to 45. My Ashkenazi Jewish is 26%. And that actually got split out a bit more where I have a separate percentage of 16% of Magyar, which is really referring to that Hungary region. So it's really kind of splitting that out more for this company. My Baltics are 8%, and it's then even referring to Basque and Greece and Balkans for that remaining percentage as well. So you can see how where the numbers are not going to be 100% the same, and sometimes they introduce different regions. So with every company that you test at is going to give you some kind of match list. And these are people that have taken the test or uploaded the results from somewhere else who share some level of DNA with you. You're going to get your closest relatives up at the very top, and then your furthest cousins towards the bottom. So you're approximately going to get anywhere, from your closest relatives out to about maybe six cousins or so. Sometimes you might see sites like Ancestry where they go fifth to eighth cousins roughly, but pretty confidently you can usually get out to about six cousins in your match list. And each match in the list is going to tell you how much DNA is shared between you and that person. And generally, it's represented by what we call the number of centimorgans. Or you might see it as a percentage like on 23andMe. So let's talk about that more. So when we understand centimorgans, and this is not centimeters, so a centimorgan is really of how we measure DNA. So it was named for American geneticist Thomas Hunt Morgan. He was doing all this research on fruit flies, for example, and he had used this, and then so this was named for him was this different level of centimorgans because he found that he was finding levels at the 100th level, and that's why you get Centi and Morgan from his last name. And it's really saying what is the distance between two positions on a chromosome that could be shared in common with someone. So if there is a higher number of centimorgans, then the closer is the relationship between those people. If it's a small amount of centimorgans, it's the more distant relationship. So for autosomal DNA, you want to look for matches that have a higher number of centimorgans when you're looking for those closer cousins. So here's a matchless example from Ancestry DNA, where I had my father that tested, I had some uncles and some other cousins that have shared. So on each of them, you can see the estimated relationship, what side of the family it came from that I've labeled, and how much centimorgans were shared. So for example, with my father, I show 3,461 centimorgans with 50% shared DNA. And then we get down to like my uncle, I get about 24% shared DNA with just under 1,700 centimorgans. So when you go into each individual profile of that match, you can actually see that information up close. So in addition to telling me the estimated relationship and how much centimorgans, it also tells me how many segments of DNA. And the idea is that you want long segments when possible. So you want a lot of DNA over a lower amount of segments if possible because that's going to show a closer relationship. So if this is saying that this second cousin's once twice removed or third cousin once removed, I share 50 centimorgans across three segments. Well, depending on what those levels look like, some of those might not be as quite as close. But if I had, for example, where one segment was, let's say, 20 centimorgans, that's a pretty nice, good chunk of DNA that we're finding. So it's helpful to look at those type of information on your match list to see, well, how is the DNA spread across that? And you can even click into these estimated relationships to find out more. So I learned with this match that across the 50 centimorgans that I have um, that there's this unweighted shared DNA. And unweighted basically is referring to that the ancestry is not doing anything to how they're measuring that DNA. They're not applying an algorithm. So unweighted, I share 61 centimorgans actually, with the longest segment being 32, which is still pretty big. That's about half is on one segment. I then get all these estimated relationships. So there could be many ways you could be related to someone, knowing that the company is just going to make a good educated guess of what relationship you have, but they're not going to know that because they don't know your genealogy and the paper trail where you can confirm that. Under frequency of relationships, it tells you approximately what are the chances that you will have that specific relationship. So I have a 35% of this being a half third cousin, or 33% could be a fourth cousin, 25% a third cousin, or even a 7% a half second cousin. And even though the percentages might seem like those are the closest options, I've definitely found a number of matches where they've been in the smaller frequencies. So it's really helpful to make sure again that you're using this as a tool with your genealogy research to identify the correct relationships. When you're working with your matches, some tips I like to recommend is that you're looking for specific people or surnames in common on your family tree. Always good if you spot a very specific ancestor or at least the surname that you can start with. That's always the first thing. And if you don't have surnames in common or you don't know about a surname, the next thing you might want to start looking at is, well, what locations are in common? Do I show a place where I know the family's lived or they've migrated to or from that seems familiar? And then a lot of times, what you may need to do is work with your matches, send them questions, introduce yourself in that process and say, like, hi, I noticed that we are cousins of this level, and I'm looking into this particular line and wanted to see if maybe you had more research on this ancestor in your tree. So you may want to be very specific on what you're looking for. Always be patient when you're contacting your matches because you don't know what's going on in their lives right now. Whether there's things going on, whether in the news, like for example, like with the California wildfires, for example, or something else going on where they're just not going to be coming back right away. So always be patient, knowing that you might need to wait for them to come back when they're catching up. And it's always good to make a friend out of the person that you're working with that may you share DNA with because they may have a lot of good information for you and be able to help you with that mystery. But always make sure you're taking your DNA results and you're also verifying them against genealogical records as well to verify that your findings are accurate. So another thing you want to do when you're looking at some of these online trees of your DNA matches is, again, looking for when there might be surnames in common. Ancestry DNA has a nice tool in that if you have surnames in your tree, they actually will highlight them in green on your DNA match list when you're looking at their trees. So I see this particular match that's that second cousin three times removed has a McKenna line. Well, I have McKennas, and that's why they're highlighted in green, and they also have a Doherty line. So that gets my interest that that might be the line to focus on. You could actually scroll down under shared surnames, and I see that they have there's 9 people of the Doherty line, 9 people of the McKenna line that I might be interested in. So, and sometimes you even get these ancestor birth locations in the map below that might give you some clues too. But when I click on that McKenna line, it gives me a pop-up that shows here's all the people that are in my family tree. So, and that 9 is going to include my tree and that matches tree. So I see I have 6 people in my own tree with a McKenna, and this person in their tree, they actually have 3. So I'd be curious about looking into this particular match to find out, well, maybe where does my McKenna line fit in? So, and again, so because these surnames are in common or highlighted in green, we want to go back to those surnames and try to find out more details about them. So we want to always go back to that tree. And I noticed when I clicked into one of them that there was a Michael Eugene McKenna that was a son of a McKenna and a Doherty. So that really got my interest more. But more so, I noticed that they were actually born in County Monaghan, Ireland, and that's where I know I have a lot of my family from. So I want to then view them in their own tree to see what other facts they might already have. So here I see Michael Eugene McKenna, born 1851, died in Lancashire, England. I see their facts that they've already added onto their tree, including different census records, a death index. I see their wife's name. I see their children's names. So I'm starting to gather information even before I even contact them to see what they already know. So now I'm thinking about, okay, I have enough information to go back to them and actually get in touch with them. So now what I can do in a lot of these platforms is look for the option to contact the match or message the match. Most of them have an option to message or contact them directly through the site and introduce myself. So I may want to say like, "Hi, I noticed that, we are, approximately half second cousin, twice removed, a third cousin once removed. And this is on my father's side. I notice you have a McKenna line with ties to County Monaghan, and let's say I wanna look into this further with you." Always helpful as well when you're trying to reach out to these different matches is because DNA messaging platforms can change and can be hard to use sometimes. Always good sometimes to provide your email address with them because sometimes matches want to take it offline and talk to you elsewhere. Now, in a lot of these different sites, they give you also what are known as shared matches, which means that if I don't know how I'm related to this match, I may want to look at others that are in common with this match to see if I can figure out where we might have a common ancestor or at least a line I want to look into. Ancestry specifically is going to show you these shared matches that are fourth cousin or closer. So noticing that they have shared matches on a DNA match can be helpful to narrow down where they possibly could fit into your tree, knowing that they might not be as far out as you think. So here's an example of a shared match list at Ancestry. So I see that this match is matching my father, one of my uncles, and some other cousins that I know of. So this is starting to narrow down what potential lines I need to look into further to see how we're related. Let's talk about reviewing your Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA test results. So as I mentioned, you also get a match list with Y-DNA and mitochondrial. Now, a little bit different with why DNA mitochondrial is this idea of the genetic distance. So instead of getting the number of centimorgans where you want a high number, in this case, you want a lower number. And the reason why is genetic distance is really looking at the level of mutation and differences between matches. So you want as close to 0 or 1 as possible for those really close matches you're trying to identify. Now, if you're looking at someone that could be going back into, let's say, the 1700s, 1600s, you might be able to go out a few steps of what they call it, or distance, where it might be more consistent with what you're looking for. But you generally are finding this when you're going into your match list that in family tree DNA, they break it down based on the number of markers you've tested at, and then you can then look at the level of matches with your closest matches or lowest distance at the top and your highest genetic distance at the bottom. So when we want to look at those difference in mutations, again, we want to look at the looking for a 0, which means that it is an exact match. So this is really great for when you're trying to identify that you have someone on the direct paternal line that you're related to, for example, or on in the case of mitochondrial DNA on the direct maternal line. So ideally, you want to look at those closest distance first to work through those because they might be more valuable. So in your family tree DNA Y-DNA matches, you also have the haplogroup. So this is that human migration code that is auto-assigned. This is from my father's results. So they are showing with a haplogroup of R, and then it gives you a code. It's something that is generated automatically. You don't have to do anything with it, but it gives you an idea of like he has largely British Isles ancestry, which is why he has matches that have paternal country of origin as Ireland or England. This gives you a visual of the haplogroup map. So this is showing from Y Atom, what we call, coming out of Africa, and showing the different patterns. So with the R group, it could go more towards the British Isles through France and Germany. It could go up through Belarus towards Poland, or even go um, through Kazakhstan and going more towards China. So you could see how there's different groupings of where this fits in. And this is how the groups are kind of assigned is based on these different haplogroup migration patterns. On your Y-DNA matches, you also get this time predictor, which is at the very end. It looks like a little calendar. And with this calendar, it lets you see what the approximate time predictor is for the genetic distance. So for that match, if I notice that it is all the way out to, let's say, 8 steps genetic distance, my most recent common ancestor with that match, it for my father, is actually all the way back to an average of 1450 Common Era, or anywhere between 1100 and 1700. So that's quite a spread. So knowing that the average is 1450, we're looking at probably before a lot of records are really going to be created. But there is still a chance there could be something if it was a little bit later, into like the 1500s, 1600s, we may eventually figure it out, which is why it's helpful to look at your closest distance, because you'll notice that your most recent common ancestor range is going to get a little bit smaller, such as with a genetic distance of 0 or 1, you're looking at under 111 markers 1850 common era with a range between roughly 1700 and 1900 common era, which is much more manageable to find records for. Now, a tip you want to use is on Family Tree DNA is that they already give you the email address when you go on their profile page, so you don't have to play around with their messaging platform. They just give you the email address directly, and you could email them as you need to in your email platform. And where you see this is you go to your match, you go to their profile, and then there is an email address that is then displayed. And then you could then use that, copy and paste it into your email, and then email them directly, which makes it a lot easier. Now, for mitochondrial DNA matches, it's very similar. You get a genetic distance. So these are all my matches when I tested myself, looking at my direct maternal line. So I'm noticing that I have a lot of people that are at the genetic distance of 0, and I have my haplogroup. It's very different than my father's line because it's a different type of ancestry. And similarly, I have a haplogroup map as well for mitochondrial. So this is mitochondrial Eve with the same idea coming out of Africa. And my mother's side, since it's mostly Eastern European, I'm going through more Romania, Austria, Germany in the J haplogroup. Family Tree DNA has a projects that you can join. They are projects that are based on the regions of where your family was living. So it could be down to specific countries, counties, regions as well. It also is based on different surnames. So since my maiden name is Doherty, this is actually suggested groups based on my father's last name being Doherty, and saying where were other Dohertys joining from. So that's why I have the Doherty group. I have different groups from Ireland, and even other places like Chelsea, Massachusetts. They even have apparently some Dohertys that actually had joined. So they give you some suggestions of groups that you may be interested in, and you can also then search their list for other groups that you may be interested in to join these one name or one place studies. And what's good about these kind of groups is you can then go into their charts. They have charts available for Y-DNA and mitochondrial in many cases. And I can then see, well, how do I fit into someone else's group based on the results? So looking at that classic chart, I can see that the administrator of the group had categorized some of the different early Dohertys. So they basically went back to the O'Doherty clan, and they basically were starting to categorize different ones based on different time periods of where matches fit in. So this can really help you when you're looking into much more distant ancestry of where you might fit in with others, and that might help you identify a potential common ancestor and region of where they're from, based on where you fit in, based on how the administrators define you in that group. Now, another important thing to look at is how to find others to test. Because it's not enough that you need to also test your DNA potentially, but you may need to compare your results to someone else. It's possible that you may need to find a very specific person in your family that can test because they are a generation closer and will give you a possibility for answers for that common ancestor. So in some cases, you may find that, quote, your DNA may be, quote, useless for a more distant project where you need someone that is the generation closer to help give you that information. Now, it's not always easy to talk to strangers and ask them to give over some of their most precious thing they can give you, which is their DNA. So I find that sometimes it can be helpful is when you're trying to find an ideal candidate is one is always good to look for people that already are interested in genealogy. You will have a much stronger success rate finding someone that is already doing genealogy that may want to test their DNA than a complete stranger that you contact through Facebook, for example. But you also may identify other potential relatives based on obituary research and other common records and online forums where you identify other relatives. And it's always good when you're trying to test someone if you need someone, have a backup candidate or more. This way, if someone decides to decline, you have that option to test someone else. Now, when you're asking someone to test their DNA, you want to consider that obviously it could be a sensitive topic. It could reveal, some secrets, some skeletons in the closet. Always good to be very transparent and upfront with what you were looking for. And it's helpful if you can give something back to them, whether it's like I'm going to share my results. I have family photos or things I can share with you about the family, something just to give more confidence about why you're just requesting their DNA. People are very cautious about, potential scams that are out there. So you want to make sure that you're coming as genuine and transparent as possible. Now, there are lots of good ways of communication. I always find anything written is always helpful too. Obviously, not showing up on their doorstep, but thinking of using email, Facebook, other social media, phone, potentially maybe even putting something in writing via letter, and maybe even putting a query in print. For example, we have a American Ancestors column in our magazine where you can actually write up that you're doing a DNA study and try to recruit people, put your email in there and let people contact you. And that could be another way. Or even just contacting someone on their online tree, again, prioritizing those people that are doing genealogy. I've enlisted some different informed consent agreements in the paid handout that you may want to look at. These just help you understand of what's going to happen with their results. So basically, what types of tests they're taking, what's going to happen to their DNA, are you going to upload it elsewhere, who is going to look at it. These are just going to give you some ideas of how you can make people more comfortable. They are not legally binding forms. They are not done by a lawyer. So genetic genealogist, is a type of attorney, but he's not an attorney for this type of practice, but he has made a lot of these forms available. So here's an example of one of these agreements. It basically just explains what's going to happen with your DNA and letting them check off of what they're comfortable happening to their DNA results, if they want to have a summary of their test results, if they want to have an alias assigned to them. It basically just gives you all the different scenarios available so that you can answer all their questions. So be patient and sensitive when you're dealing with asking people questions about their DNA because it could be a very private matter and you may uncover some secrets along the way. So when we say expect surprises, I literally expect surprises. I went into this in my DNA thinking that I would never find anything unexpected, that everything would be quite boring. And I think it's farther from the truth. I definitely have uncovered, adoptions or different unexpected parentage results and new relatives and others. And it's not means to scare you. It's just to let you know that expect the unexpected. I think if you go in knowing that things could come up, it's gonna be helpful just to understand when it does come up. And when it does, you just need to make sure you really understand it before jumping to any conclusions about how to proceed next. So some of those surprises that you may come across could be what we call non-paternal events, and that means then when the paternity of a match is not expected. So, for example, if you found out your father is not your biological father, if you found out your grandparent was not your biological grandparent, things like that, where you find that there is a direct break in that line, or you found out someone is adopted, for example, and they did not know that they were adopted. These kind of results are typically seen in our autosomal DNA results, but you also can see them in your Y-DNA, especially when you are looking at a certain surname and there's no evidence of that surname coming up. That may raise a bit of a flag to look for. So I know we're running a little over, so I'm just going to finish up with some online resources before we go to questions. One great resource is the Shared Centimorgan Project. It was developed by genetic genealogist Blaine Bettinger, and it is on the DNA Painter website. It basically allows you to enter the total number of centimorgans for a match, and you can enter the number of centimorgans or a percentage from like 23andMe. And what it does is it takes this chart and it highlights the possible relationships that could be based on this. This chart shows you the middle number is the mid range of that number of centimorgans, and then you have underneath it the low to the high. So it gives you different possibilities for different relationships, knowing that, especially when you start moving out into, let's say, first cousin, second cousin, third cousin, you start to have more options available of is there a once removed or another option that you can use. As I mentioned before, there was the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, which had that great wiki chart. They are very much as they noted themselves as the first society founded to promote the use of DNA testing in genealogy. So they are looking at different things related to ethics and how to update their genetics glossary and different things that you can help understand about genetic genealogy. So it's definitely a really wonderful resource, and I really recommend using like the wiki to keep up to date with what's going on in genetic genealogy. Uh, Blaine Bettinger also did the Shared Centimorgan Project as well, but he also had a blog called The Genetic Genealogist. It's not actively updated. I don't think he's really been pursuing this, but there are archived blog posts that you can get to from thegeneticgenealogist.com, and he is also the author of the Family Tree Guide to DNA Testing and Genetic Genealogy, which is already in its second edition. There also is a Facebook group that Blaine Bettinger also helped found, is one of the admins for, called the Genetic Genealogy Tips and Techniques. It's on Facebook, and whether you are a beginner to advanced, you can ask different questions and get some advice from others in this group. So, in case you're looking for more of a social forum. Uh, Judy Russell's has the blog called The Legal Genealogist. And so lots of times there are different terms and conditions updates and other things that are coming up where you need to be aware of things that are changed, maybe updates at GEDmatch. So she definitely can give you that legal perspective of what she thinks about some of the changes going on and what should happen. And there are usually a lot of different posts on DNA. And of course, we can help you. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have a DNA column in the American Ancestors magazine since 2003. We also have a column with that column, we write that we regularly try to write different case studies or advice or what's going on new. And I've been contributing to it along with Christopher Child and others at our organization. We do education programs like this, and we even have an upcoming course coming up in the next few weeks. So if you want to learn more and get a more in-depth view of DNA, we can do research for hire, where we can even help you look into a DNA, a mystery, do a more in-depth study, even help you with cases of DNA proof arguments for lineage societies. Or some organizations are even doing that, and sometimes you need help writing those. One of my favorite pieces is, of course, consultations, which I'll talk about in a moment. We also partner with DNA companies like GEDmatch to offer discounts, and we even do different publications such as Portable Genealogists, which are laminated guides, The Stranger in My Genes by Bill Griffith, who talks about his own nocturnal event that he uncovered in his family tree, and other publications from our Newbury Street Press. We have a DNA resources page on our website on AmericanAncestors.org, which gives you a PDF of a DNA and genealogy research guide, some of our different product offerings, past webinars, and other things that you can do, and we keep that updated as well. As I mentioned, one of my favorite things to do is DNA consultations. Now, this is not a picture of me. This is actually one of my former colleagues and authors. And so, one of the things we do is called a consultation, which means we are giving you advice and can even help you review your DNA results, give you advice on what to do next, form a research plan, and help you understand them. We can do these in person. We are actually going to be opening our building starting next week in January 21st. So you can start to schedule it in person. It could be done via phone or online via Zoom. So we can do lots of things with reviewing your results and help you understand it. We keep these results private. And we do send you some notes as well as some next steps. And I do the majority of consultations on DNA, and I'm happy to help you with any mystery you have. With our DNA consultations, there also is a past video that I recorded a couple years ago on what to expect on a DNA consultation. This is the URL, and I believe it's in our handout as well. This is helpful so you can understand what to expect from a consultation and what's going to happen so you can prepare for it. And this is also the QR code that lets you go right directly to our page, or you can go to AmericanAncestors.org/expert help/consultations to book a consultation. We book approximately 4 to 6 weeks out. So, in review, I hope this class has shown you about the different types of DNA tests that exist: autosomal, mitochondrial, and y-DNA, and how they reflect the different levels of DNA that are being tested. It's helpful by understanding each of the different limitations of each test to determine what test is best for your research goals. You may not you may find that you don't need to jump right to a mitochondrial or y-DNA test unless it's needed. So always best to try to maybe start with an autosomal test and figure out which company maybe has the features that you're most interested in. And of course, always review your closest DNA matches first and try to find things like surnames and locations in common. This is a really good grounding point to make sure that you are looking at the closest hanging fruit, so to speak, of trying to identify those closest matches that can help you answer your genealogical questions. Thank you. And now we'll get ready to turn over for some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Melanie, for that great lecture this afternoon. So much great information shared there. So I know we're a little bit over time, but we will get to your questions. First, I just want to quickly highlight some upcoming events that you might be interested in. First up, Melanie mentioned that we have a great online course coming up that will dive deeper into the topic of DNA. It's called Making Connections, Interpreting DNA Results. That will be offered over 5 weeks. And Melanie is one of the main presenters for that, as well as our genealogist Chris Child as well. Then we have an online research workshop on preserving your family history research, documents, bound volumes, and photographs. This will be a really fun online program. It's a little bit more interactive. Participants have the opportunity to come off mute, come on camera, ask questions, interact with the experts. So highly recommend checking that out. And then finally, we have another free lecture coming up on researching famine Irish ancestors in Ireland's poor law unions. This will be presented by our colleague Rhonda R. McClure, and that's coming up in February, so definitely check that out. And then quickly, I also just wanted to mention that we currently have a membership promotion going on. You can become a member today for $25 off with the code JAN25, and that will be active through the end of the month. And if you have any questions about that, you can contact our member services team and they will be happy to help. All right, so now we will go ahead and turn to your questions. We've had a lot of great questions coming in, so we'll get to as many as we can here. So first up, Melanie, we have a question here asking if some testing companies are better than others for certain ethnic groups. For example, does one company have a bigger database of Irish ancestry or Jewish ancestry? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So there definitely are some possible differences between the companies, and that's based on the audience that they use. So Ancestry, I will say, is the largest overall. So I generally will recommend Ancestry to most people because they usually cover a lot of the different regions. I will say that said, that MyHeritage does have a very strong European market as well as family tree DNA as well. So a lot of times you'll find a lot of people from the British Isles or different parts of Eastern Europe and other places that will be on those sites respectively. More Eastern Europe is going to be on MyHeritage, which is an Israeli-based company, and Family Tree DNA I find does have a lot more British Isles sometimes. And Living DNA is also going to focus on a more British Isles approach, but it is a much smaller database. So I generally like to start with Ancestry and then maybe upload the results to Family Tree and MyHeritage, which you can do and not have to retest.
Okay, perfect. Great. Thank you very much. Then we have a question here asking, can the contributing X chromosome from the mother be from her father or her mother? Or is it sort of a combination of both her father and mother?
Yeah, and that's why it gets a little bit complicated because you're right. It can be a bit of a combination that you're getting in that case. It's not like we see with mitochondrial where it's more intact being passed down. So because you get that combination, it is hard to determine where that X chromosome is coming from, mother or father, which is why I find that it's easier to look at a DNA match that is a male that is an X chromosome match because then you know it only comes from his mother's line.
Okay, great. Thank you, Melanie. Then we got a lot of questions from different folks who are looking to identify, say, their fifth great grandfather or seventh great grandmother, or kind of trying to figure out what DNA they might have inherited from those ancestors.
Mhm.
Is that possible, and how would you recommend kind of going about that?
Yeah, well, if you're trying to go out to your fifth grade grandparent, generally you're going to use an autosomal test. So I would use a company like Ancestry. But if you're trying to go out beyond that fifth grade grandparent, that's when you're going to need to look at mitochondrial and Y-DNA and see if you have the right person for that line. So if you are not in that direct line of that descent, whether through the maternal line or paternal line, you may need to locate another cousin in that family to take that test.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then a question here. Someone asks, is there a difference between just kind of uploading your DNA to multiple sites versus taking the tests individually from each of those sites? Any difference there?
Not necessarily. I mean, pretty much when you upload your results, you're basically inserting your DNA into what they call that chip so that it can be used to test against. So it really doesn't make a large difference if you take the test, let's say at Family Tree DNA, or you upload to it. You're largely going to get a lot of the results. The biggest thing is going to be obviously if you don't pay the unlock fee, you don't get all the tools inherited than if you took the test directly with them. So sometimes there could be that added piece. But personally, yeah, I've uploaded my DNA to many different places, and I don't really notice a major difference than if I had taken the test directly with them.
Okay, great. Thank you. Um, and then we also received multiple questions from folks kind of wondering about the advantages of getting siblings or maybe nieces and nephews, parents tested. Could you kind of give a quick overview of the advantages of that?
Sure. So I would say, I mean, definitely having like parents testing, it was great because that's one generation closer than what you're going to see on your family. So that's always a first, is obviously trying to test the older generation as much as possible, just because you get that one generation closer with an autosomal test. In terms of testing, siblings, it depends on what you're trying to look at. If you are full siblings, it may not be, you may get some ethnicity percentages that slightly differ, but unless you're trying to look at a potential, non-paternal event, or looking at maybe a half sibling where that might be give you a little more information, looking into their line a little more. That's where I could see maybe it being a little bit more appropriate to do that. Nieces and nephews, I mean, you're definitely welcome to test that, but again, thinking in mind, you're actually, cutting a generation down than what you are. So when possible, it's always best to try to test as many of your older relatives as possible. However, but there could be reasons why you want to test them as well, especially if you're looking into maybe more recent mysteries that come up amongst your family.
Okay, great. Thank you. Then we also got questions about, how reliable are, say, ancestry matches, particularly if you see a match that doesn't quite seem to make sense to you. And are there any steps you can take to kind of further verify that? Maybe ask for help or that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you want to do is obviously is first to see if they have a family tree that they've linked to their profile, or if they've contributed anyway to any research online. That's always a good step to first see what their level of interest is, even before maybe even you make contact. I then like to always again look at those shared matches, because that's at least going to give you at least an idea of where they might fit in, and start to narrow it down. Sometimes I also, get to resorting to maybe looking into the username of the person that is the match. So if you have someone that you have no idea who they are, sometimes I do a little digging, and I do use sites like Been Verified and others to try to find out more about them. Maybe, try to figure out an email address, and just see if that gives me a somewhat of a clue of where they fit into that family. And when in doubt, it's always good just to, maybe just potentially reach out and see if they do respond. Some people are just taking tests, obviously, just because they receive them as gifts, and or maybe you're curious about just ethnicity percentages and then not connecting with cousins. So there could be, some silence there. But I think doing a little investigative research up front can help you narrow it down more.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again so much, Melanie, for that great lecture this afternoon. And thank you to all of you out there for your great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. There were a lot of wonderful questions coming in, but unfortunately, this is all that we have time for today. But if you do have more specific questions about family history research, you might consider hiring our research services team or using our expanded chat service. I'd highly recommend checking out that chat service. It puts you in direct communication with a genealogist, and it's completely free and open to the public. And that is available Monday through Saturday from 9 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And to access that service, you just go to americanancestors.org/chat. And then, of course, Melanie also mentioned consultations. I'd highly recommend considering that as well, especially if you do want to dive deeper into your DNA results. A DNA consultation is a great way to do that and to kind of dive deeper into the different connections and discoveries that you can make with your DNA. So thank you all again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of our members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to help keep these programs free and to create more free programs as well. I hope to see you all at our online programs in the future, and goodbye for now.